All right, so we're live. My name is Casey Horn. I'd like to welcome you to my studio. This is the June 2020 Rittenhouse Square Fine Art Show. And this year we're doing an online or virtual tour of artist studios, and that way you can see kind of behind the curtain and the magic and where it happens and how it happens. So first of all, I'd like to talk to you about myself a little bit. I'm a sculptor. I am a fabricator, so what that means is I actually work directly in metal. I don't work in clay. Most sculptors start by working in clay, and then they go through a whole process called lost wax art casting, and there'll be a link in the comments you guys can click on to a really cool video that's put together by the National Sculpture Society, and that'll show you a little bit more information about that part of the process. I do use a little bit of casting in my sculpture, but all of the originals start out as just raw material, raw steel, stainless steel, aluminum, and bronze. And I use different materials for their different properties. So each of these different types of metal has properties that I like to use for specific applications. There are also reasons for using different materials based on budget for a project. All of these different materials have a wide range of difference in pricing. So a sheet of bronze, it's about 2 foot wide by 10 foot long, is going to run about $2,000. So it's very costly. It's mostly copper. Bronze is about 95% copper, and so that's why it's so expensive to use. Aluminum is a fraction of the cost of bronze. But a really cool side note with aluminum is there was a point in time in history where aluminum was more expensive than diamond. So if you ever think about aluminum and you want to think about how it's cheap or not worth much, just think about there was a point in time when Napoleon used to serve all of his dinner guests on gold plates, but only the emperor could eat off an aluminum plate because of the cost and value of aluminum. So aluminum and stainless have properties that I utilize based on their ability to withstand oxidation. Bronze is going to oxidize over time outdoors, and aluminum and stainless steel are going to be a little more impervious to oxidation. So that's another application why I would use that material in a certain circumstance. Before I get too far along, I just want to invite you to put in any comments in. I've got Carrie Ann, my creative adjacent, and my beautiful bride helping me out here with that. So she's going to let me know if there's any questions or comments that I can respond to.
Florence from Philly is joining you.
All right. Hello. Welcome, Florence. And then my oldest daughter, Courtney, is the producer here, and she's running the video. So thank you, Courtney. Anyway, so yeah, feel free to type in questions, and I'll kind of take those as they come. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how I take this material here and turn it into something like this. So let's move on to some of the other processes, how I go about taking the materials and actually forming them and sculpting them into the sculptures that I create. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to use a plasma cutter, so you guys can get a little example of how one of the methods I use to cut metal. There's some different means I use for cutting metal. One of them is a mechanical means, so I actually use like a saw, and I can use either an abrasive saw or I can use a saw with carbide teeth. It's a harder material than the material I'm cutting, so it allows me to actually cut through that. But the plasma cutter is basically a type of arc cutting. So what it's going to do is it's going to generate a plasma arc here at the tip, and it's safe to watch through your screen, so you'll be fine. You're going to see a bright light and a lot of sparks, so it'll be kind of cool. So the plasma cutter is going to generate an electric arc, which superheats the material that I'm cutting. And then I utilize compressed air that actually pushes through that nozzle, and so that'll take that superheated puddle of metal and push it through, and then I could just continue cutting so that I can cut out what the shape of what I'm going to make out of the metal there. So give me just a second. I'm going to turn on the plasma cutter. It's going to be a little bit noisy because you're going to hear air escaping, but it shouldn't be too bad. And one other thing, I got to put on my personal protective equipment. So I got rubber gloves here. These latex gloves protect my skin from absorbing heavy metals and other caustic things. There's a lot of hazardous materials I work with here in the studio. So I use latex gloves to prevent those things from being absorbed through my skin. Got my eye protection and my steel-toed boots. I also wear several layers of clothing, and that prevents any sparks or ultraviolet radiation from the welder or the plasma cutter from sunburning me. Because this generates an arc, that arc produces ultraviolet radiation, and so you can get a sunburn pretty quickly if you're not protected just from the arc on the plasma cutter or the welder. And then last of all, here I've got my welding hood, and I've got it set for cutting rather than welding. When I'm cutting material, it's actually a little bit lighter shade. When I'm welding, it's dark enough that I can basically look at the sun without injuring my eyes. So that's going to go on now. You should be able to still hear me as I'm talking, but you're not going to be able to see my face for a few minutes. So let's give this a go. Now you can hear probably the air, and it's just pushing through the metal as it's superheated. You can see all those sparks. That's the metal being pushed through. So you can see how quickly you can cut through the metal. Now this is still pretty hot. But you can see there's just a little bit of slag, and this is mild steel. So this is just regular steel. And with different metals, what I'll actually have to do is I'll have to go ahead and clean up that edge to prepare it for welding. Because right now there's a lot of oxidized steel on there, and so that will prevent the steel from welding. It'll actually contaminate the weld as well. So that's one tool that I use a lot in the studio for cutting materials, and I cut different materials. So that's steel. I don't use a lot of steel because it oxidizes so rapidly. It's not a material that I use much in sculpting. Like we said before, you use more bronze, which looks similar because it's oxidized a little bit, stainless steel and aluminum. So let's go ahead and move on from plasma cutting, unless there's anyone who wants to see that again. And I'll show you another process in sculpting, which is TIG welding. So I've got this great big area out here for doing large scale pieces, kind of like this one here. And you can see where those flat sheets are being formed and welded together to create a three-dimensional shape rather than just a flat sheet. So, and if you come in a little closer, you can see how I use spacers in here to create volume. And then you can also see some of the welding going on down here. There's a weld bead which is joining these two sheets together. So that's what I'm going to do right now, is I'm going to do a little bit of TIG welding so you can see that part of the process. Again, you're going to lose me because I'm going to go behind the hood here, and I've got to change from cutting to welding. I'm going to protect my eyes because it's going to be much more intense. That was bright. The welding's even brighter. So I've got a few tools laid out here on my workbench. I've got some different hammers. I do a lot of hammering on metal to bend it and shape it to get to the shape that I need. So I've got a smaller ball peen hammer, a little bit larger ball peen hammer. I got my mini sledge, and then I have Mjolnir. And if you're not familiar with Mjolnir, that's Thor's hammer. So this is when things really need to get moving. I picked that one. So this piece here I have in front of me is a piece that's cast. And because of the casting process, and follow that link that are in the comments there, it's cut up in pieces. So when I pick up the raw material, the raw bronze from the foundry, there's a lot of processes that I have to go through to put it back together so that it actually becomes the sculpture that I created originally. So each of these pieces has been prepped. So I've ground the edge, chamfered it, and you can see how it's shiny right there as opposed to the top where it's oxidized. So that removes any oxidation, cleans up the area in preparation for welding. And then I have to find the different pieces that fit together, so we get to play a little puzzle here. And then what I have to do is I have to make sure that the pieces are fit up exactly when I weld them together. Now I'm going to turn on the welder, so give me just a minute. This is a water-cooled TIG welder, so there's a couple things to turn on here. TIG welder uses argon to create a gas shield around what I'm welding, and that prevents contamination and oxidation in the metal when it's in a liquid state. So TIG welder is similar to some other types of welding just in the way that it works. It is a form of arc welding, and what you're doing, like the plasma cutter, you're generating an electric arc which superheats the metal. The difference in this and the plasma cutter is we're not cutting the metal, we're just heating it up. So this is going to create liquid bronze, and then what I'm going to do is heat up both surfaces and they will fuse together. And I'm going to just tack weld it in a couple spots here to get it to fit up properly before I do a full weld on the sculpture. So I'm holding these together so that they're flush and lined up. And once I get it lined up where I want it, then I can tack it together. So this was set for aluminum welding. You heard it has a little bit of a buzz. So when I'm welding aluminum with the TIG welder, you have to weld alternating current. You can't weld direct current. Everything else I weld with, I weld on direct current. So I'm just going to switch to direct current since we're welding on bronze, and you'll hear the difference when I go to make the next weld. And I didn't like how that was lined up, so I just broke that tack, and I'm going to line it up again, get a little bit closer to where I want it to be. That way I don't have to hammer on it so much. You can hear the difference. It's much quieter, you don't have that buzz. So that's tack welded there. And you can see these two surfaces aren't exactly matched up. So I'm just going to bend it a little bit, bend that first tack weld, so I can get those closer to where they're aligned. You see that okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tack this side as well so that it holds everything in place. I'm going to try and do it from the side so you can see a little bit more of what's going on here. You won't be able to see exactly because it's too bright for the camera, but you'll see a little more. So I'm heating up both materials until they come to a liquid point. And now that they're at a liquid point, I can weld them together. So there's a small tack weld there. It doesn't look very hot, but it's extremely hot. The arc that's being generated is as hot as the surface of the sun. So it's extremely hot. That's why I'm wearing these very thick welding gloves. And I don't like wasting rod. It gets short. When it gets too short to hold, I'll actually attach it to another rod, and that way I'm not wasting material. So now I can use the rest of that rod. So go ahead and I'm going to tack it in 2 more places and just check the whole surface, make sure I like if it's consistent and flush, and then I'm going to go ahead and weld it. So here's another tack on this corner here. I really like welding with bronze. It's very forgiving. Some metals are more prone to contamination and they're a little harder to work with for that reason. Aluminum is one of those metals. So, but it can be tricky, but I like working with aluminum too. It's completely different material to work with than bronze. So now I've got a weld on each corner, a little tack weld. And what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and run a weld across here to fuse these 2 pieces together. So now I'm heating up the material and I'm just drawing that puddle of molten bronze towards me, and as I do, I'm introducing a little bit of this filler rod, this bronze welding rod, into that puddle. And what that's doing is that's adding material to that chamfered area of the sculpture where I ground off in preparation for welding. So, and I had said before that I do that to remove contaminants. That's one reason. Another reason is because I want to make sure that my weld is strong enough to hold the whole sculpture together. And because we have to grind off part of the weld, what happens is when I grind that off smooth, I still have all this weld material down here in the bottom that's left to hold the bronze together. So that's TIG welding there on bronze. And what we'll do now is we're going to move over into the grind booth, and I'll show you some of the processes that go on there to take a piece that's welded into its final stages in preparation for patina and finishing. So I'll leave these here because I'm not actually going to do any grinding because it's very loud, and that's not something that you would find pleasant to listen to. So let's come on in the grind booth. I do some grinding out here, but because it creates a lot of mess, I try and do most of my grinding here in the grind booth. There's a lot of dust that's produced when you're grinding metal. You use a lot of different abrasives, and it creates a real fine dust and it gets everywhere. One other cool fact about bronze is when it oxidizes, it turns green. And when it interacts with the sweat on your body, it turns you green. So this prevents me from looking like the Hulk. So this is my grind booth. This is where I do smaller pieces and where I grind anything that's small enough to fit on my table, where I'm doing most of the grinding. This is some of the grind material that's created from the grinding process on these sculptures. So you can see it's pretty fine. It gets everywhere. And so I try and contain that here in the studio, in the grind booth. So a lot of the grinding that I do is pneumatic, and what that is they're air tools. So I have a great big compressor in another room that generates compressed air, and it drives these tools, causes them to rotate and spin. And I've got a lot of different tools that I use for a lot of different parts of the grinding process. And in the industry, in metal finishing, we call it chasing. So these are metal chasing tools. So some of the ones I have lined up here, this is a cutting wheel, and when you plug it in to the air and depress the trigger, it causes it to rotate. So that rotation and the abrasive quality of the wheel is going to cut the metal. Some other abrasives or some other types of chasing tools are carbide die grinders. And if you look close, you can see that these have different teeth or different grooves on them for cutting. This one has a close together tooth on it. I can use this for grinding materials like bronze and stainless steel. This one, they're a lot bigger, and that's for grinding aluminum because aluminum is very soft, so it gets in there and it gums up in the carbide. So the bigger tooth, the bigger knurl on there allows it to not get stuck. So there's different size carbide tools for different applications. So I get down to really, really fine carbide tools, and that's so I can grind detailed work. And then once I'm done with these heavier duty tools, I go into a finish type tool, and that's for more fine finish sanding. So I think we need to move forward. Some of the other grinding tools, this is an abrasive wheel on a 4-inch grinder, and that's actually something I use to take just a regular smooth material and texture it, and that's how I create the bamboo for my wall pieces. So that's actually done with that grinder. All right, so let's go ahead and head out, and we're going to take a look at the next part of the process, which is patina. And patina, what we're doing is we're actually forcing the metal to oxidize. And it's a really cool process. There's a lot of chemistry involved. But basically, if you want to remember what patina is, it's just a fancy word for rust. So in this area over here, you can see it's starting to look pretty dirty and messy. And so that's because patina is messy to deal with. We're going to be taking different chemicals and applying them to the surface of bronze while it's hot. So there's a very fine line that we want to work in when we're doing patina. If metal is too hot, then the patina chemicals won't attach to the surface. They won't etch and bite, and we won't get the coloration and the textures we want. If it's too cold, patina chemicals are going to drip down. Then we're not going to, again, be able to create the textures we want, and the patina chemicals are just going to run off. So I'm going to use a propane torch, and I'm going to heat up the material, and then I'll show you a couple different types of patina applied to the surface of the bronze. So let me turn on the tank here and get the propane going. So this propane torch, I've got a couple different patina chemicals set up here. The first one that I'm going to show you is sulfurated potash. And sulfurated potash, used to darken the bronze, it basically just turns it black or dark brown. So this one you don't actually heat the metal with because it reacts pretty quickly. You can see how quickly that metal is just turning dark. So the more I apply and the longer I let it sit on there, the darker it's going to get. That's sulfurated potash. So you can use sulfurated potash just alone as a patina, and you see some sculptures that are just completely black, and a lot of that is just sulfurated potash on the bronze. It gives it a nice warm black finish. So that's the sulfurated potash. It does not have a pleasant smell. It smells like rotten eggs. That's the sulfur. Another patina chemical I use here is titanium dioxide. And titanium dioxide is basically oxidized titanium. This is how it's found naturally. So is actually in a powdered form, just white powder. And we can actually take that white powder and through different technologies turn it into the metal we know as titanium. So we're going to do, you can see here on the piece of bronze, there's some just natural oxidations, some green up here at the top, and that's because, again, bronze is mostly copper, and copper oxidizes naturally green. So you'll see kind of how these different patina chemicals react with one another. So at one point, we're going to get that nice green cupric patina up there to turn into an ochre by adding some different chemicals to that. So that I can see as I'm heating up this sheet of bronze, I can see the metal or the water evaporating off the metal. You probably can't see that on there. But now I know it's hot enough based on basically the color that it's changed and that the water is evaporated. So the titanium dioxide is used to create texture on the sculpture. And you can see I'm creating these rings and they're overlapping. And on a lot of the sculptures you'll see of mine, there's several layers of this ringing. And I do that to create an illusion of depth. It's like you're looking down into a dark stone, or a wet stone. There's layers, it's deep. If I do just one layer, it kind of looks flat. But if I do layer over layer, that gives it more depth. So because this is a liquid that I'm applying, I have to continue to heat the surface of the bronze. So every time I apply the chemical, it cools off a little bit. So you can see there how the chemical is starting to oxidize the bronze. And then you got a drip there. That's because it's a little cooler out here. I've had my heat focused over here, so you can see that it dripped. And that's something we want to avoid because we don't want to have drips on the patina. So there's the titanium dioxide. You can see I can layer over that coat of sulfurated potash that we put on there. So these chemicals are able to be used together to create different effects in the finished patina. So that's one chemical. Another chemical I'm going to use is ferric nitrate. And ferric nitrate is basically iron and nitric acid. You use the nitric acid to both dissolve the iron into a liquid suspension and also to etch and to bite into the bronze to help it adhere. So again, we have to have the surface hot enough that it's going to react. You can see how that green is starting to go ochre, because now what we're doing is we're basically forcing the bronze to rust with iron. And so that's how we get the warmer colors, is we're actually forcing the bronze to do something it wouldn't do naturally, which is oxidize in the fashion that iron would. You can hear it's pretty hot. The surface of this metal we're working with is about 300 degrees. You can get some really rich, deep tones with the iron. So with the ferric nitrate, we can get anywhere from a really light gold to a deep burgundy. You can see how the colors are changing just based on how much chemical I'm applying. Over here, where I'm just putting the ferric nitrate on the bronze, you're getting more of that dark coloration. And then you can see as it changes, as it goes across that titanium dioxide, it's warming that up. And there's a different level of concentration here than there is down here in this corner. But if I just apply heat alone, it'll also force it to oxidize more, and we can get darker colors that way. So there's a whole process to patina. There's a lot to use, there's a lot involved.
Somebody says they're jealous of that torch. That this is fascinating.
Well, I'm glad you find this fascinating. The whole reason we're doing this is so that you guys have an opportunity to be part of the art show, even though we can't be there on the square this year. So I'm so glad you guys are tuning in. This is all for you. And for me, this is exciting because this is not something that I can normally do at an art show. I can't bring out a torch and start doing patinas in public. I'm jealous of the painters who can actually work in paint in plein air. But my easel and my canvas and my brush are not something that the fire marshals like to allow at art shows. So,
Do you have to worry about fumes?
yes, and normally I would be wearing a respirator. At this point, someone asked, I don't know if you heard the question. The question was, do I have to worry about fumes? And the answer is yes. I normally wear a respirator that traps organic fumes. Because I'm filming and I'm not doing a lot of work here today, I want you to be able to hear me and see me. I'm not wearing that respirator, but that's a very good question. It is something that is very serious. So we have to make sure that we're not exposing ourselves, again, whether we're absorbing those chemicals that we're using through our skin or we're aspirating them, breathing them in. So at this point, once the patina is finished, which that's not, but once the patina is finished, allow that metal to cool. And then when it's done cooling, actually apply several coats of lacquer. And again, this is somewhere where I definitely would be wearing a respirator because there's a lot of solvents in the lacquer that are very harmful. So that's something that I would definitely be cautious of. So the lacquer is used to seal in the patina, protect it from elements, and protect things from altering the patina over time. These two pieces here have been sealed with lacquer, and you can see how there's a nice luster to it. So that lacquer creates that nice luster. You can see the depth that it brings out all the color and pigmentation in the patina, and it just gives it that beautiful finish. So from this point, what I would do would be base the piece, and we're not going to go into basing today just because of time, and again, it's a process that's not quiet. I use a drill press to drill through the granite, and I use diamond bits because granite is very hard. So I would drill the holes that are created for the fasteners on the sculpture. You can see here there are bolts in the bottom of the sculpture, and those were actually created by drilling and tapping into the bronze. So I drill an appropriate size hole, and then I use a tap to create threads. So basically I just create a nut inside the sculpture by drilling and tapping that bronze. That allows me to utilize fasteners, and then I can then attach my granite base to the sculpture that's complete. So with the little bit of time we have left, I'd like to introduce you to some of my work.
Amy'd like to tell you she enjoys seeing your process.
Oh, thanks, Amy. I'm glad you're here to see it. If anyone has any questions or you'd like to comment, you're more than welcome to. We're going to go through some of my pieces now, and I neglected to talk about my subject matter. So artists are inspired by different things. One thing that I've always been inspired by is language, and I actually use language or calligraphy as a subject matter for my sculpture. So what I do is I start with, in this case, most of these pieces are Chinese characters. So I start with the written language, the calligraphy of ink on paper. I study that and how it is written, and I take that and transform it into a three-dimensional Chinese character. So one of the things that I really appreciate about language is that these are all words. So every sculpture is a word, and every word tells a story. So some of the stories behind these pieces are actually within their construction. This is the Chinese character Tranquility, and this piece has a special place in my heart because it was actually the first piece I did in this series. It was actually a Christmas present for my wife, Carrie Ann. And this is the Chinese character Tranquility. It's a compound character. So if you look at how it's made up, the bottom portion here is the word woman, and then above that we have an ornamental roof. So the idea is that a woman's at peace in a beautiful home. So each one of these sculptures has that kind of meaning, and I use those color and texture to tie in the meaning of the sculpture, and so that they tell their own story. This one is the Chinese character for water, and you can see the ringing in the surface there. Again, that's part of that patina process that we just showed you. Those rings were created by using titanium dioxide, and then I used different chemicals and pigments over that. One of the fun things about water is that there's a lot of movement to the sculpture, and your eye wants to move away, but as an artist, I want to keep you focused on the artwork. So what I do is I use that darker blue in the center, and that draws your eye back in so that you stay focused visually on the sculpture itself. When I first created this piece, I had just those center ripples there at the bottom, and it didn't feel complete. So what I did is I went back in and I welded that second set of ripples in, and it really helped add a lot to the piece. Gave it a little bit more movement. So there's some other pieces here that I'd like to show you. This one is fire, and fire, like water, is part of that elemental series. You can see that great texture on the surface of fire. What you're seeing is actually some grinding that I did prior to the patina process. And the patina used on this is that ferric nitrate patina. It's translucent, so it allows the light to pass through the patina reflect off the surface of the metal and then back out again. So what you're seeing are those grinding patterns that I put on there intentionally. Now this is not something you would do normally on a finished sculpture. You wouldn't want to see the grind marks. It detracts from the finish of the piece. But in this case, it's something that works beautifully to display that quality of fire. This next piece I have here is Woman, and you might recognize that from part of Tranquility. Woman is using two different metals. This back material here is bronze and the front is stainless steel. I like to describe this piece as warm colors, soft curves, and refined lines represent the elegance of woman. And so that one is titled Elegance. Then up above here you have a triptych. So along with language, I'm also inspired by sumi painting. And again, that's brushwork on paper. It's not something you normally see in a three-dimensional format. So what I'm doing is actually creating three-dimensional sumi paintings. And so this piece was inspired by a painting of cherry blossoms on a dressing screen. And so what I've done is I've taken that idea of a two-dimensional painting and then transformed it into a three-dimensional painting. And again, here you have different materials. The background is aluminum. The cherry blossoms are stainless steel, and these are all hand-formed out of sheet stainless. And then the branches are bronze, and those are hand-formed out of bronze rod. So it's actually not a mold of a branch. It actually starts out as a perfectly smooth and round bronze rod. So, and this one actually, the background there, again, my creative adjacent, my bride, gives me a lot of inspiration. She helps me out a lot with just different suggestions, and she wanted to see cherry blossom with a blue background. I normally do it with a red background, but we have this beautiful blue sky in Colorado, and so she wanted to see the blue background like you're laying there in the grass looking up through the branches into the sky and seeing that color. So the language that I'm using here again is mostly Chinese characters, and there's different ways of writing those characters. We think of, in our own language, when we're writing, we have printing and we have cursive. And so I transition here in this display I have from a printed version of characters into what's called grass script. So grass script is it's a more poetic form of writing. And so what you actually do when you're writing these characters is you ink your brush, inhale, and you lay your brush on the paper, and as you exhale, you write the whole character in one fluid brush stroke without lifting the brush. And so I'm doing something similar to that in the metal. I'm allowing that metal to flow through the entire sculpture in one fluid movement. And so that's why these look a little different in style than the first ones we saw, because it's a different style of writing. So they're fashioned after that grass script format. So this one you see here is the Chinese character for dream. And dream is actually a compound character. At the bottom here you have the word evening. Above that is a roof. And then in the center here you have the word vision. So a dream is something you literally see under your roof at night. And I love incorporating the meaning, how these words came about as far as their construction, how they're used in language, and then also, you know, the culture behind it, how those words came about by their meaning. The next piece here I'd like to show you is mindfulness. And mindfulness is another compound character. The bottom here we have the word heart, and then above that is the word now. And mindfulness is recognizing where your heart is in the moment, and the moment is always changing. So I like having a reason for things. There's an intentionality to things. The colors are intentional, the textures are intentional, the movement is intentional. So the whole reason behind the movement is it's part of the meaning of the character. It's part of the meaning of the sculpture. But again, you have that nice warmth of heart and the bright gold of the moment. So moving on to another piece. This is another kinetic piece. This is a piece that I've done recently. It's in a series about words that inspire. This is actually the character Beauty. And beauty is definitely something that inspires. There's a lot more to beauty than just an aesthetic. Beauty is powerful. Beauty heals. Beauty motivates. There's a lot there, and I think we often take beauty for granted and we just think of it as an aesthetic and move on from that. But there's so much more to things that are beautiful than just their appearance. I think we have a question or a comment.
Just a couple comments.
Sure.
A couple people are saying good work.
Oh, thanks.
Another
Appreciate that.
person, Carrie, saying beautiful. And Kristen says the mindfulness sculpture is fascinating.
Thank you, Kristen.
Another, I guess, a question. If
Great.
you touch it with your fingers or hand, does that harm the material if you touch it too often?
No, that's a great question. So the question was, if you touch the sculpture too often with your hand, will it harm it? The lacquer protects the sculpture from a lot of things. If it's in an outdoor setting where you're getting a lot of rain and snow, dust, there are different things that we do to apply and protect the sculpture from those elements. Excuse me. If they're in a public setting, like a public piece of artwork, over time, if it's touched by thousands, hundreds and thousands of people, it will wear down that protective coating of that lacquer, and it will wear through the patina eventually, and you'll be back to that bare metal. So when you're walking around and you see public work, you'll notice certain areas of it where people have touched it. It's probably bright, or it has a different coloration than the rest of it, and that is because you have oils and stuff in your skin that will affect patina over time. So you're not going to affect the patina on this piece by just getting it going like that. If you had a lot of lotion or things on your skin and you're touching it every day, you may eventually wear down the lacquer that's protecting it, and it will alter the patina. It won't affect the metal, but it can alter the patina. So, and then we have a couple pieces here on the wall. Those are bamboo, and again, those are inspired by Sumi painting. In Sumi painting, there are what's called the four virtues, or the four gentlemen, and bamboo is one of them. That represents strength, and it also represents summer. The others are chrysanthemum, which represents autumn, and it also represents honor. You use a white chrysanthemum to honor someone who's no longer with you. There is the plum blossom, which represents winter, and it also represents hope. It's the first flower to bloom in late winter, and so it's that reminder that spring is coming, and so to hold on and hope. And then spring is an orchid, and that also represents purity. So then you have summer again. So the last piece I have here to show you is loyalty, and you might recognize part of this sculpture here from mindfulness. And that's because I've used the same base word in both of these, which is heart. And heart is a word that's found in a lot of other words within the Chinese language. It's words that are, it's a word that's used in other words that have to do with thought and emotion. So you'll find it in words like courage and love, endurance, and loyalty also incorporates that word heart. And again, this is a kinetic piece. So the meaning behind loyalty is, again, what it's the different words it's comprised of. It's also a compound character. So you have the word heart at the bottom here, and then up at the top you have the word middle or center. And loyalty is something of importance that is placed in the center of your heart that your devotion revolves around. And I used some of the same coloration in loyalty that we saw in mindfulness. There's a little more of a deep purple here. I like the idea of loyalty being purple, like a purple heart. And there's no other, I think it's the greatest form that you can show as far as loyalty or sacrifice is to put your life on the line for others. And so I wanted to incorporate that idea down there. So that pretty much wraps up our time that we have today. Do we have any other questions or comments before we go?
Yes, beautiful work. And
Thank you.
Also, how often do you go to China? At least I think you do.
Who was asking a question?
I'm not sure how to
All right. So someone asked if I travel out of the United States. I'm wondering if you're wondering if that's where I find inspiration. I have been to Asia recently. We were there from my granddaughter's birth. My son-in-law was stationed in Korea, in South Korea, and so we were there for the birth of our granddaughter a couple of years ago. It's just fascinating cultures. And I'm inspired by different cultures and different languages all over the world, and I work in different languages as well. So if you have something in calligraphy you'd like to see done, you're welcome to ask me about that. I enjoy doing commissions as well. So we're just going to travel back over here to where we started, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about sunset. So I forgot we had one more piece to talk about, and so you see this great big piece behind me. That's actually a 10-foot tall version of sunset. And so one of the fun things that I get to do as a fabricator is I can actually work in scale to fit whatever the need of the project is. So I can take something this size and scale it up, or I can work the other way as well. So come on, step up. I'll show you a little bit about that patina as well. So in Japanese, this character is used to represent evening. So I actually have a version of sunset that goes from a light blue to a black, and it has a silver moon. In Chinese, this character is used to represent sunset. So it's same time of day, a little different meaning culturally, and you'll see that a lot. The Japanese, about 2,000 years ago, didn't have their own written language, and so they adapted a lot of the Chinese characters to their spoken language. So the way you say the word, she or you, is different, but when you write it, a lot of times it has the same or similar meaning in both languages. So this is a copper moon. So it's like a harvest moon in a sunset sky. You can see the little purple cloud there at the top. It's catching a little bit more light from the sun. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I want to thank you again for joining me in my studio. Oh,
a little more time.
Carrie is handing me an applied knowledge puzzle since we have a few minutes. So I do a lot of art shows. That's the primary source of sales for me as an artist is art shows. And people come to art shows and they're often intimidated to interact with the art or touch the art. And so what I did was I created this sculpture to encourage people to interact with art. It's called Applied Knowledge, and it's actually a puzzle. And there's an idea behind the puzzle. Each piece represents knowledge. So these are things you acquire throughout life. And when you apply that knowledge, you can build with it. That's called wisdom. So wisdom is not about knowing all this stuff. It's about what you do with what you know. And with that, I want to thank you again for joining me in the studio tour for the June 2020 Rittenhouse Square Fine Art Show. Have a good day.